Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure and privilege to be able to speak to you today. And I do hope that the circumstances shall change very quickly, and so that we may be able to see each other and meet in person. Sadly, Dr. Baran, my colleague, was not able to be here today, so I will take the liberty of conducting our presentation single-handedly. So I have conducted a selection of specific issues connected to the topic of our section with the hope that you will find them interesting and worthwhile. Let me start with a brief introduction to the structure of relevant Polish legislation. I assume you don't have much prior exposure to it. And the most important piece of legislation in this context is the Criminal Fiscal Code. It regulates both the rules of criminal liability and the rules for criminal fiscal procedure. However, it draws very extensively on the provisions of general criminal code and general criminal procedure code. So these three pieces of legislation must be read together, which can be somewhat challenging. The other important piece of legislation is the tax ordinance. This act sets out the general rules for tax law, as well as the rules for tax procedure. And at this point, I would like to highlight that as of today, there is no plea agreements per se in the context of tax law. It's possible to enter an agreement with a tax authority as far as the interpretation of tax law is concerned, but no plea agreements as such. However, currently there are advanced works on a project of new tax ordinance that is to include agreements between fiscal authority and the taxpayer. However, these works have been ongoing for several years now, and it's difficult to predict whether and if this new tax ordinance will come into effect. Finally, the last piece of legislation that I would like to draw your attention to is the National Revenue Administration Act that sets out the rules and the structure for Polish fiscal authorities. And interestingly, I think it was overhauled in 2017, and generally the changes went along the lines of consolidating and centralizing the structure. Within fiscal authorities, it's useful to point out two basic kinds, so-called Customs Fiscal Office and Fiscal Office. The difference is that the Customs Fiscal Office, which was introduced during the overhaul of 2017, it's a uniform service, and it's designed to tackle, generally speaking, major fiscal offenses, whereas the Fiscal Office is generally charged with general administration of tax law and tackling of minor offenses. And when speaking about position of fiscal authorities within a criminal fiscal procedure, it's necessary to give some attention to the role of the prosecutor, who in some instances is supervising the procedures. In some instances, generally when relatively minor offenses are concerned, fiscal authorities can act without the supervision of the prosecutor, but even then they need they have to file certain motions via the prosecutor. So, for example, this is the motion to apply temporary arrest. This has to be done via the prosecutor. Having said that, having outlined the general structure of relevant legislation and the structure of the fiscal authority, I would like to tell you about an interesting, I believe, overlap between tax law, tax ordinance, and criminal fiscal law, which is connected to the statute of limitations. Fiscal authorities have the capacity to commence criminal fiscal proceedings, and the said proceedings freeze, they stop the statute of limitations regarding tax liabilities. And this has been used rather extensively in order to bypass, circumvent statute of limitations generally. So what would often happen is that the fiscal authority would start a criminal fiscal proceeding solely or mostly with the purpose of freezing the statute of limitations, and very often no other actions were conducted in this regard. And these decisions were challenged by the taxpayers with the administrative courts, and there were discrepancies as far as the administrative court's rulings were concerned. Some courts ruled that they have the capacity, they have the jurisdiction to evaluate, to review the validity of such decisions, and other courts ruled that they do not have the jurisdiction to review such decisions. And this ongoing discussion basically ended as of May 2021, when the Supreme Administrative Court has issued a resolution in which it decided that administrative courts have the capacity, have the jurisdiction to review the validity of such decisions, and if they decide that these decisions were used instrumentally to bypass, to circumvent statute of limitations, they should be struck down, and this resolution is binding to the other courts. Moving on, I would like to point your attention to a very popular and quite important, widely used institution of Polish tax law connected with criminal tax law, which is filing a correction of a tax return. So taxpayers have the right to file a correction of a tax return. This was designed to allow the taxpayers, if they made a mistake, to avoid criminal liability and basically fix their mistake, and there was an assumption that they will be acting in good faith. And if such correction of a tax return is filed properly, and the overdue tax is paid either immediately or within the time frame set by the tax authority, then the taxpayer is not, the perpetrator rather, is not subject to criminal liability, even if there was already a criminal fiscal proceeding in place. So this is quite liberal, and unfortunately, as Dr. Menschel mentioned, which I wholeheartedly agree, this is also the case of Poland. Most taxpayers are honest and they act in good faith. There is a minority that doesn't, and unfortunately, due to the actions of this minority, everybody suffers. And this institution was, one can argue that abused to avoid criminal liability when there was no mistake made, but when a deed was conducted intentionally. And this is about to change because starting from January 2022, if a criminal fiscal proceeding is in place, there is no possibility of filing a correction of a tax return. As of today, this possibility of filing a correction of tax return is limited basically only if there is a formal tax audit or tax procedure in place. But after the audit or the procedure is over, the taxpayer gets back the right to file the correction limited only if there was a tax decision with which sets up the amount of tax liability. So if the tax liability was set up by a decision, then the tax return could not be corrected. So generally, a broad way to avoid criminal fiscal responsibility, abuse to a certain degree. And there is definitely a consensual element here, because the taxpayer, when filing a correction, admits that there was a mistake. Well, everybody says it's a mistake, but very often it was not a mistake. It's basically a trick to avoid financial criminal responsibility. But as I said, this is to be narrowed starting next year. Another quite popular institution that I would like to draw your attention to is the voluntary submission to criminal liability. This happens pre-trial. So before the indictment is filed with a court, the perpetrator may file to voluntarily submit him or herself to criminal liability. He or she must pay the outstanding public levy, pay a fine set by the fiscal authority, pay the cost of proceedings. And if this is done, the court, the fiscal authority files the submission to the court, and if the court agrees, then basically this is the end of the story for the perpetrator. However, there is one potentially important issue here. These rulings are subject to registration in official criminal register. So, for example, if a practicing lawyer agrees to this voluntary submission to criminal liability, which is quite often proposed by fiscal authorities, this may lessen, let's say, possibly at least lessen the scope of criminal liability, but could also take away the possibility of practicing law. So, as far as the correction of tax return goes, and the voluntary submission to criminal liability, these are popular. This happens a lot, and especially the voluntary submission to criminal liability is often even pushed upon the taxpayers. But these are not all elements that have not all institutions that have voluntary elements to them. And the other two that I will very briefly point out is the disclosure of an offense. So basically, generally speaking, if the perpetrator discloses the important information about the offense, he or she may avoid criminal liability. Of course, there are conditions that must be met. It's not possible in all circumstances. During the trial, there is also a possibility of sui generis plea bargaining. This requires a motion by the defendant. It's at the discretion of the court if whether to agree or not to this motion, and the court may agree if the guilt and circumstances are not doubtful, are not in doubt. And there must be no objection on behalf of prosecution. So if these elements are in place, this kind of plea bargaining is possible during the trial. I'm very excited about the possibility of formal agreements between taxpayer and the tax authority as far as tax ordinance is concerned. But as I said, we are waiting for this new ordinance for many years now, and it's still being postponed because the Polish tax law, as I suspect in other countries is quite similar, changes all the time, and there are changes introduced to tax ordinance all the time. So this makes it difficult to update the project of the tax ordinance, and hence we are waiting, and probably we'll wait for some more time. So I hope you found these elements interesting, and I'd be very happy to do my best to address possible questions. Thank you very much for your attention.